the problem was urgent. Right now, I think the only word you can use is disastrous, cataclysmic. It's disastrous. So the question now, I think it's very intriguing and very interesting. Everybody has some sense of that, but there's no way we can have a mobilized way of dealing with this situation. The question, of course, is now, can we save the planet? Which seems to be a major issue. And also the notion that the life support systems of the planet, so far as the scientists and people are able to understand, appreciate, the systems are in free fall. In other words, just going down the drain in a kind of increased rapidity. There are all kinds of examples. Some of the examples only occurred this year. For example, he also pointed out, for the first time in human history, we detected open ocean. In other words, the North Pole is leaking, which will lead to major climatic change. We know that. It will link, perhaps not this year, next year, but it's going to happen. Everybody's aware of that. And the Amazon, the largest rainforest, actually was losing its ground. The Amazon twice the rate as many of the very pessimistic predictions were made a few years ago. So the situation is much more serious. We know the climate of South America will change very significantly if 40% of the rainforest are gone. But Brazil, the government, that's the largest rainforest in that sense, is struggling to save 10%. This is the goal. This is not something, 10% of the Amazon. But at the current rate, that all rainforests of the world will be gone by 2050, within your lifetime, no question about that. And of course, the depletion of depleting oceans and fisheries because of the pollutants and so forth, not renewable, and that process is getting speed. And it's going on very, very fast. And we can develop a strategy for example, for climate change. My Professor Michael McElroy in environmental studies here is one of the leading scholars in dealing with the question of the global warming issue. To stabilize, according to their account, to stabilize the greenhouse forcing gas, the gases that will produce greenhouse effect, that have been doubled. We know that been doubled in terms of its historical concentrations within our lifetime, in a sense, in the last 25 years. Never happened before. We know that. And if we want to reverse the trend, we need to reduce 70% of the greenhouse forcing gases. As you know, that the United States, with a very small population, internationally speaking, in fact is producing about 20–25% of the greenhouse effect. In order to reverse that, we need to reduce by 70%. And now we have international community has difficulty of agreeing on 7%. And after the Kyoto Accord, that discussion collapsed in The Hague this year. And the United States is mainly responsible for that. We are not able to deal with the situation. We know that we spend about 30 billion subsidies for fossil fuels and for the nuclear industries, no more than 1 billion for efficiency, for solar energy, or for any kind of renewables. And more interestingly, it's related to also the feminist issue, is our conception, what is value from the economic point of view. You know, in the feminist discussion, if we do not consider household work, nurturing, raising children, all these as work, they're not compensated. And therefore, those kind of work in the life world have been marginalized. But in our accounting, economic accounting, in the current market system, clean air, fresh water, and other ecological systems that provide a service for the human community are basically priced at zero. We do not price them, and we just take them for granted. Now, once we need to price them, we know the seriousness of the problem. So many scientists, not necessarily ecologically concerned or religiously concerned, actually arrived at the conclusion, ever since the Union of Scientists meeting in 1992, that human beings and the natural world are in a collision course. And this is the ethical dilemma in the collision course. And if we use simply economic terms, we're living off our ecological capital, as we are. It's a kind of a bankrupt economic strategy. We just live off the capitals, not renewing it, and it's depleting extremely fast. Now, we can think, it is very interesting, it's not difficult, it doesn't require any kind of major intellectual jump, that the whole economy, the economy as a whole, the globalizing economy, is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. We have to think about that. Because its resource, the whole economy, the resource base, it is being polluted, degraded, dissipated, and of course, irretrievably compromised. And we've been going on, just taking it for granted for a long time. And unfortunately, within your generation, you see major repercussions. And so the vulnerability of the Earth as an ecosystem is obvious, no question about it. And even China, which refused to sign the 1972 preamble of the Stockholm Conference because China was still obsessed with science and technology and also with development. Because in the preamble there's a statement, there's a limit to growth and there's a limit to science and technology. China, during the Cultural Revolution at the time, still believed so strongly that science is a panacea or technology is a panacea. They refused to sign that declaration. But even China in 1973 began an ecological movement. They called it environmental protection movement. But the environmental protection movement, you look at the movement there, as compared with China as an economic engine for development. The situation, the choice is clear. We have to develop. And we have to suffer the consequences in the short run situation. We may be able to deal with the question of environment eventually, but development is the goal, very clearly defined as a national goal. It is in this sense then we see an ethical question of a global significance. That is the conflict between economic development and environmental protection. Now China, with a population of 1.2 billion, and maybe increased to 1.6 before the population begins to decline, nobody knows, with the one-child policy of 1979, and officially concerned about development, but it also has environmental implications. Population planning, in a way, is important for the environment. With now 6 billion people, and maybe increase to 10 billion, the sustainability of the resources will be greatly limited. And of course, India, originally a very good case of family planning and under the support of many American foundations, but because of the ideological conflict with questions of abortion, with the question of the support for life, and most of these programs under the American support discontinued, and the population of India is now increasing very, very rapidly. I think before long, maybe in the next 20 years or so, India will become the most populous nation in the world, more than China. And if you look at Indonesia and other places. So this is also a question about population and environment. So since 1973, even China, with the environmental protection movement, becomes critically aware of this problem. And yet, development as a national goal or national strategy is so powerful, there's no way to reverse the trend. We earlier mentioned, I think mentioned time and time again, that Confucian humanism, with this emphasis on mutuality between heaven and the human mind, and also sustainable harmonious relationship with nature, is basically congenial to the development of a kind of environmental ethic. But the Confucian revival as a modern ideology is from the environmental point of view, is a mixed blessing at best. The revival of Confucianism since the end of the Second World War, first, of course, in industrial East Asia, in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, but more recently in socialist East Asia, in mainland China, in Vietnam, and also in North Korea, suggests on the surface that a tradition, Confucian tradition, with all the conflicts between some basic Confucian value orientation and the ideas developed in the modern West, has been modernized for certain political and economic ends. In other words, the Confucian resources, the Confucian ideas, the Confucian values, even though considered detrimental to growth, to development, since the Second World War, turned out to be congenial to the modernizing process. We don't have to go into the complexity of some of those issues. Actually, some of the most brilliant Confucian thinkers in East Asia were instrumental in transforming the tradition, the Confucian tradition, from an agrarian mode of thinking to an ethic congenial to industrial cosmopolitan society. Singapore is a good example, but Japan, South Korea, Taiwan as well. So for years, Confucianism enjoyed state sponsorship in Taiwan, in South Korea, and in Singapore. So if Confucianism has survived as a political ideology in industrial East Asia, it seems that it has transcended its feudal past and now become a viable tradition shaping East Asian modernity. That's the reason we talk about the relevance of Confucian humanism to East Asian modernity. And one specific area of the revival of Confucianism is focused on the work ethic. There's a special kind of work ethic that helped East Asia to become economically vibrant. And it also, as I pointed out earlier, there's some distinctive features, the so-called distinctive features of societies under Confucian influence, the government leadership, society based upon certain kind of civility rather than a law, and some emphasis on group orientation rather than individualism and so forth. Mainland China, under the influence of Maoism, was openly hostile to Confucian theory and practice. But the Confucian ideas manifested as habits of the heart have been quite pervasive in all walks of life, among the workers, the farmers, the soldiers, and even the intellectual elite. So, socialist East Asia now, China, Vietnam, North Korea, challenged by industrial East Asia, has taken a more positive attitude towards its Confucian roots. Beijing government, I think, more recently has been very direct in trying to promote Confucian values. So there's a very strong belief that Confucian ethics is congenial to economic development. Even the government leadership is, of course, extremely important in trying to promote that. So the Confucian ethics that have emerged in socialist East Asia under the influence of the modernistic ethos is a confirmation rather than a critique of the Enlightenment mentality. what we call the Enlightenment idea, with emphasis on rationality, emphasis on the human capacity to transform the world, to change nature, and to organize equitable societies. So embedded in that particular orientation is very strong anthropocentrism, focused upon the human condition exclusively. Because it takes instrumental rationality as its modus operandi, its way of doing things, its precept can be easily co-opted by social engineering as a mechanism of control. So there is a very strong belief that there is a kind of capitalism, we call it network capitalism or Confucian capitalism, that could be considered as an alternative way of the modernizing East Asian societies, and a little bit different from modern Western capitalism, but it has its own strengths. Of course, limitations as well. One scholar has done a lot of work. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, by the name of Gordon Redding. A book called The Chinese Spirit of Capitalism. Basically, the kind of capitalism fueled by Confucian ideas. Actually, over the weekend, there's a Berkeley-Harvard collaboration of faculty in East Asian Studies, a one-day conference on East Asian capitalism. So-called East Asian capitalism is network capitalism with emphasis on the capacity of the groups to organize ways of generating capital and consensus formation, group orientation, and to reduce the transactional costs by developing certain kind of mechanism of raising capital, very different from the legalistic capitalism of the West. But since the Asian financial crisis in 1997, people are also worried about the question of lack of transparency of this kind of capitalism and the question of lack of public accountability of this kind of capitalism. But it's still considered as an important alternative to Western capitalism. So there's a euphoria on the part of many scholars, especially in Confucian studies, that Confucian ethics with emphasis on work ethic, on network, on group, on consensus formation, on orientation based upon familial and other kinds of regional relationships, in fact, develop a very vibrant modern capitalism. And this kind of capitalism also puts a great deal of emphasis on social engineering as a statecraft. In other words, the government leadership, together with the intellectual elite, probably the business elite, they try to develop an overall strategy for development for the society as a whole. So this kind of rationalist, scientific ethos is totally anthropocentric, no question about it. Successful nation building requires the accumulation of economic capital, enhancement of technical competence, upgrading of cognitive intelligence, and improvement of material conditions. So these are the major strengths of East Asia. Many institutes of higher learning in East Asia are in fact institutes of technology. And liberal arts education, small liberal arts school like Swarthmore, like Hamilton, like Haverford, and these are rare in East Asia. Most of the East Asian universities are like state universities with huge departments of engineering, of science, now especially computer science and so forth. And there's also a great deal of emphasis on cognitive intelligence in terms of mathematics. If we compare with the mathematical competences of East Asian college students with the rest of the world, they ranked very much on top of the 10. And extremely competent in engineering, in mathematics, and so forth. Cognitive intelligence is extremely important, and everything is calculated in terms of the material conditions. So there's, in a curious way, very little emphasis on the social capital, on cultural competence, in terms of higher learning, and ethical intelligence, not to mention spiritual values. So there's a very strong preference for technical solutions to well-defined problems, and the pervasive influence of the technocratic mindset, which deals with, and especially difficult to deal with non-quantifiable issues, and they're relegated to the background. As a result, ecology is seriously misunderstood because the complexity of the multidisciplinary, multidimensional nature of that issue, and it's also a long-term issue, together with misunderstanding of religion. Religion and ecology, these are the two particular areas that East Asian societies, China in particular, are incapable of comprehending, despite the fact of the revival of Confucian humanism. The gigantic hydraulic project in China, called the project of the Three Gorges, maybe the largest attempt to called the damming project to control the Yangtze River, leveled local communities and historical sites. More than 1 million people were removed in order to allow the site to be developed. It significantly compromised the ecological areas it affects. There's very little discussion because the development, the hydraulic engineer believed that it would generate tremendous energy for consumption. So the questions of ecological problems relegated to the background. Even when major international groups withdrew their support, the government still persisted in its single-minded development, regardless of the long-term cost. So this commitment to development is extremely powerful. I remember in a meeting, I used the example of China, but I want to underscore the major global conflict in terms of this issue, and with the North and South, because the developing societies all believe that the environmental issues are the issues of the North, the people in America, North America, in Europe, particularly sensitive and concerned, and people in the South really do not have any possibility of entertaining some of these issues because development is so overwhelming. There was a discussion, one gentleman from England, under the influence of Schumacher, about small is beautiful, and talking about the elegant simplicity as a way of life. So it was very important to cultivate a sense of elegant simplicity. And I think maybe the current president of South Africa, was unhappy about that statement and saying that you people may have the luxury to cultivate a kind of elegant simplicity in the North. We do not have any luxury. We want to be like a developed society. We like to realize our, quote, American dream. That is to own a car, to have a house, to have a fair wage that allow us to travel. So the question then is that developed societies, highly developed societies, now become sensitive to ecological issues and are not willing to change the lifestyle in order to accommodate. And the underdeveloped or developing societies, overwhelmed by ecological issues, are not willing to deal with these issues because the eradication of poverty, the enhancement of economic capital, the enlargement of the scope of economic development become the major concern. And this is one of the reasons why we have a situation that even everybody is critically aware of the seriousness of the problem, very little is being done. The promotion of Confucianism as a kind of secular humanism, from this point of view, of course it's my own judgment, is very unfortunate because its rich resources for developing a truly ecumenical worldview and global ethic will not be tapped. Instead, a narrowly defined notion of progress rather than broad agenda for human flourishing will be underscored. Confucian ethic Confucian idea of frugality and so forth will help economic development. Confucian humanism, as we understand it here, is not secular humanism. It is a kind of anthropocosmic vision. It emphatically rejects anthropocentrism as an impoverished idea of humanity. Being human is not being simply anthropocentric, as we talked about it before. But a simple retrieval of the anthropocosmic vision is insufficient. It needs to be reappropriated with sensitivity to its potential ideological use. So I think what we face now is to become very critical of the revival of Confucianism as a kind of secular humanism, especially as a kind of authoritarian ideological mechanism of control. Confucians insisted that we begin our journey of self-realization with acknowledgement that we are concrete living human beings embedded in the world here and now. So there's no idea of a spiritual sanctuary totally outside of this world here and now. This positive attitude towards the world enables us to appreciate our natural and social environment as inseparable dimension of our humanity. But it also predisposes us to accept the status quo as intrinsically reasonable or intrinsically valuable. This is a serious dilemma. We honor the world in which we live. We don't want to create a spiritual sanctuary totally outside, and yet because we honor the world we live in, if the world is unjust, if the world is controlled by some kind of authoritarian mechanism, the Confucians will be able to tolerate. And that toleration turns out to be intrinsically self-defeating. The danger of abusing the reconstructed Confucian values as a kind of neo-authoritarian justification for domination is always present. So when we have this term Asian values, quote, Confucian values, that have been enthusiastically promoted as positive factors in economic growth, in political stability, in social cohesiveness, we need to be cautious. The emphasis on self-discipline, on duty consciousness, on diligence, frugality, on networking, collaboration or cooperation, consensus formation, or harmony, these are all identified as salient features of Confucian economic and political culture. But at this particular critical juncture, especially with the threat of the environmental issues in mind, but of course many other issues as well, these values, just as I pointed out, like self-discipline, duty consciousness, and so forth, are considered more relevant for nation building than some other values. So the Asian values discussion as a critique of, for example, human rights is itself a reflection of an anthropocentric, therefore a kind of enlightenment mentality. So what is being promoted as a revival of Confucian humanism is implicitly a form of anthropocentrism, centered upon the human community exclusively. It's a kind of social engineering, try to design everything according to the vision of the government. It's a kind of progressivism. The whole world is defined in terms of developed, underdeveloped. China is trying to catch up. And scientism, not to mention instrumentalism. So to me, one of the most depressing actually scenarios of the human condition is that with increasing clarity, we know what we ought to do so that environmental degradation will not seriously threaten the viability of our species. We know what we need to do. And yet, for structural, mental, conceptual, and other reasons, we are moving ever closer to the point of no return. And for those who have helped us scientifically, economically, politically, culturally, and religiously to see the self-destructive trajectory of development, it of course must be rather agonizing to realize that we, with all the effort and energy, the cautionary warnings have not yet been made, have not been made enough of an impact to turn the tide. So more and more we become clear what we ought to do in order to change the tide, and more and more because of the structural, not just personal, structural and other reasons, we see we're down the path of self-destruction. And this is not only true with the developing societies I just outlined, now with the revived Confucianism, to help them to become even more of an engine of development, but also highly developed societies as well. This is the context for me to talk right now briefly. I'll have a chance to do it Thursday. The possibility of an ecological turn within the Confucian tradition. And I want to mention one anecdote to help you to understand the complexity of this problem. A senior scholar by the name of Qian Mu in Taiwan, he died at the age of 96 to 97. One of his last articles he wrote in Taiwan, which is say maybe the greatest contribution Confucian humanism can actually contribute to the world is the idea of the unity of humanity and heaven. The unity of humanity and heaven. I wrote a very short article on that, and of course dictated. His wife and some of his close students first became a little bit puzzled. Said, this idea is very old. It's one of the oldest Confucian ideas. You talk as if it's a new discovery. It's not a new discovery at all. And he was very angry. He was already 96, I guess. And he said, this is my enlightenment. This is my thoroughly new, my new realization. And it's an awakening for me. He's one of the leading scholars in Chinese intellectual history and Chinese philosophy. After so many years, toward the end of his life, he decided to articulate this particular point as the greatest contribution that Confucianism can be made to the human community. Now, the article did not attract a lot of attention in Taiwan, but it attracted a great deal of attention in China. Some of the other senior scholars in China, all of them in their 80s, responded very, very enthusiastically to what Qian had to say. And some one Hong Kong scholar, Tang Junyi, also in his 80s, responded also enthusiastically. So you can say somehow 10 or 15 years ago, a group of senior, we call it elders in cultural China, not just in Taiwan, but also in mainland China and Hong Kong, came to the conclusion that there's need for articulating a very old Confucian idea for the modern world, and with a total sense of a fresh perspective. It's not something like an old statement that has been repeated time and time again. No, the sense of freshness, sense of newness is quite astonishing. So I began to look at this quite carefully. And I realized the possibility of ecological turn within this reconstructed Confucianism, which is going back to the Confucian ideas we've been talking about in this class, in the classical period and the Neo-Confucian period. For this turn to be sustainable, to be possible, the first order of business is to go beyond a very narrowly conceived scientism, especially in China, and of course secular humanism. In other words, the fight is between Confucianism as a secular humanism, therefore a political ideology for the development of East Asia as an economic engine, and Confucianism, because as an anthropocosmic vision, which may serve as a source of inspiration for the human condition, precisely because of the challenge of environmental crisis. So this is, as you know, which side is going to win, right? But I think even with a glimpse of hope that this turn is going to take place is extremely significant. If you look at China, well, maybe for that matter, United States as well, the first order of business to go beyond scientism and secular humanism and then to broaden the frame of reference. Now, for the United States, to broaden the frame of reference is to transform ourselves from simply a teaching civilization to a learning culture. That is painfully difficult. And the only way we can do that is to begin to examine national interest as the highest principle for guiding our foreign policies or guiding America in the world economic system. If national interest is the highest aspiration, highest interest, we're not going to provide the necessary moral leadership for the rest of the world, because we cannot meet the minimum requirement of the golden rule, that is, do not do to others what you would not want others to do to you. And part of the reason is because we, in fact, Tim Wirth and others have pointed out, because of our economic power, our political system, and not to mention our military might and advances in technology and science, we ought to be much more obligated in looking at the global situation in terms of the environmental degradation. For example, the major test is global warming. How are we going to deal with this situation? And what kind of sacrifices we have to make in order to be accepted not just by East Asian intellectuals but also by Europeans as a responsible and responsive member of the global community. So the frame of reference has to be broadened. If we broaden the frame of reference, for China in particular, this is the major challenge of the question of religion. If China is not able, the only way that China can deal with religious questions in a sophisticated way is to understand the cultural resources in China are not just restricted to the trajectory of economic development per se. You know, everything now is being mobilized in order to develop the economy as a precondition. Now, if China is able to broaden the scope, for example, to take India, as I pointed out, as a reference, not just for development, but also for human flourishing. Look at India as one of the examples. Then China would then begin to look at the ecological issue in a global context. And they would begin to realize that the earth is not simply, their part of the earth is not simply entrusted to them by their ancestors, but it's also something they need to be responsible for generations to come. So if you look at it not in terms of 5-year plan, but in terms of 50-year plan, in terms of 100 years, look beyond. If you have a much broader sense, then you realize that many of the problems and issues that less developed countries face turn out to be extremely significant for China as a developing society. For example, if you want to help someone, if we use the foreign aid as an example, you cannot help someone simply by instructing the person to follow the dictates of your own values. If you want to really help someone, you have to understand what the context really is. You have to become a learner of the person you're going to help. You have to really understand the situation. That understanding requires a change of a worldview, change of our own worldview about our relationships to others. So then we can return to this fascinating issue of the possibility of a sustainable, harmonious relationship between the human species and nature. The problem with secular humanism is, of course, its self-imposed limitation. Under its influence, our obsession with power and mastery over the environment to the exclusion of any kind of spiritual and natural realm has made us, some people say, autistic. We've lost the sensitivity, autistic, to environmental or ecological concerns. So our human condition is despirited and denatured. It becomes a despirited and denatured version of the human. And that idea of the human has greatly undermined humanity's aesthetic, ethical, and religious significance. So in other words, the economic calculus, or the political consideration, will have to be challenged by aesthetic, ethical, and religious significance. The interplay between the two. Economically, as an economic being, they are major prerequisites and requirements. But as aesthetic, ethical, and religious beings, there are other requirements. These will have to be negotiated and somehow compromised. Now, the kind of Confucians, the Confucian leaders, under the influence of modern discourse, are certainly deeply concerned about improving material conditions through science and technology, and promoting democracy as the surest way to attain a kind of egalitarian society. But their preoccupation with nation building, managing the world, has overpowered the spiritual and naturalistic dimensions of their inclusive humanism. In other words, the Confucians, in a curious way, modern Confucians have lost the sense of a much broader vision of human flourishing and focused exclusively on the economic and political development. So the ecological focus is a necessary corrective to the modernistic discourse that has reduced the Confucian worldview to a kind of limited and limiting secular humanism. Especially when Confucianism appropriated by the modernistic mindset has been misused as a justification for authoritarian polity. So only if the Confucian tradition can fully incorporate the religious and naturalistic dimensions, this is the implications of the ecological turn, would they be able to formulate a critique of instrumental rationality and social engineering as national policies. So Confucianism, in a way, must free itself from the modernistic mindset of development at all cost and re-examine its relationship to authoritarian polity as a precondition for its own creative transformation. To facilitate a sustainable and harmonious human-earth communication for the Confucians is to return to their own home base rather than a departure from its source. So the best way for the Confucians to attain anew, in this sense, to attain anew is to reanimate the old. And to reanimate the old, like Mr. Chen and others, is to try to think carefully about the true resources of the tradition for the modern human condition. And these resources will have to be tapped. Now, if there's no ecological turn at all, and everybody is very much overwhelmed by the engine of development, then the voice cannot even be heard, the possibility will not even be realized. Now, fortunately, this is happening with the emergence of what we call public intellectuals in China. For the first time, ecological issues are being raised not simply as an integral part of the economic development strategy, but as a different way of learning to be human. So the question then is, if we know that China re-emerged as an economic power, as a political presence, even as a military presence. What is the cultural message of China's re-emergence if China is going to embrace Confucianism as part of its ideology? What is the cultural message? Is China's rise in the international situation dictated by wealth and power simply means China is going to retaliate because China has been humiliated for a long time, or China is going to share power? Most people just believe that retaliation and sharing power may be the highest motivations, but maybe the obvious motivations. But I still would like to ask, I continue to ask the question whenever I have a chance, both in China here, but what is the cultural message of China's re-emergence? How would China think as a new rising power in reference to South Asia, Latin America, the Islamic societies. In other words, would China be happy that China's re-emergence is at the expense of the development of other societies? China is going to use all the resources available for China's development at the expense of other resources. All the development will be so broadly defined that it will be a mutual flourishing in a much broader sense. Is this trajectory, for example, we need to think about that issue in the United States too. What is best for us, unless it is also best for all others, the best for us may be constrained by a very limited conception of human flourishing. So the ecological issue now frames in the broader sense of what human flourishing ought to be. And with that, the possibility of some kind of dialogue of civilizations and some kind of communication. But it's, as I pointed out, painfully difficult. Oh, I want to remind you, is it Thursday afternoon? Yeah, Thursday afternoon at 4 o'clock?
4 o'clock, Harvard Engine Common Room. We have Boston Confucianism and the Comparative Metaphysics lecture, all of the teaching stuff in this class, and given by Professor Robert Neville from Boston University. He is the author of Boston Confucianism, which is the science reading in this class. So please come and work on everything.
Yeah.
Thursday, 46, Harvard Engine Common Room.
Did you?